Our State of the U.S. segment tonight, according to a New York Times article, Donald Trump Jr. took a meeting during the 2016 campaign with a Kremlin-connected Russian lawyer after being offered damaging information about Hillary Clinton. Now, the article relies on anonymous sources and insinuates that there was wrongdoing, but is there anything criminal about collecting opposition research? With me now, former campaign manager for Donald Trump and current OAN political commentator, Corey Lewandowski. Corey, thanks for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
All right, Corey, this story is unfolding as we speak. Donald Trump Jr. released the email chain between he and the mediator, between he and the Russian lawyer this morning. I mean, Democrats are already calling this treasonous because within this email chain, there is they're very open about the fact that they work for the Russians. Is this treason?
Look, what I think it is, and let's just take a step back for 1 second and think what was taking place in June of 2016. Nobody had mentioned Russia. Nobody had mentioned anything to do with Russia. There was never even a whiff of anything to do with Russia and the campaign. And as a matter of fact, our government's own CIA didn't notify the Obama administration until sometime in August that they thought Russia was potentially meddling in the U.S. election cycle, at which time the Obama administration did nothing to prevent that from continuing. So the notion that Don Jr. had a meeting with an individual who said that they had information that they wanted to provide to the campaign that they thought was going to be helpful to the Trump campaign was not out of the ordinary in any step, way, shape, or form.
Right, and I understand that. I think you make a good point about even the Obama administration wasn't notified until August, so that wouldn't have even been on the radar of the Trump campaign at the time. I also think it puts to bed the argument coming from the left that there was collusion to gather this information between the Trump campaign and the Russians, because clearly this individual was offering something to the Trumps that the Trumps were unaware of. But let me ask you, is that standard procedure? Is that an ethical thing to do on the part of Donald Trump Jr.? Even if it's not a crime, is that an ethical thing to do if a representative of a foreign government offers you damaging information on your opponent in order to help you win? Should he have turned that down?
Well, I think the real question is, from what I've read and the media reports have said, is that Donald Trump Jr. didn't know who the individual was that was taking the meeting or really what the purpose of the meeting was. And it was fairly short, 20 to 30 minute long meeting. It sounded like it was arranged through a mutual friend, someone who Don Jr. had a previous existing relationship with. And again, from what that individual said, this person may have information that could potentially be helpful to your father's campaign for president. And so I think the intrigue probably allowed him to take a meeting with a person who he didn't know who the individual was, to listen to what information might be available. And that's not out of the course of the ordinary for a person in a political campaign to sit with someone who might have information that could potentially help you be successful at the end of the campaign.
Right, and I think that's standard, too, in business, which is what the Trumps, especially Donald Jr., was an expert in business. That's normal operating procedure in business. We know that there's a lot of murky water with opposition research. We can look to the Democratic opposition research firm Fusion GPS, who released that debunked dossier. I mean, clearly there are sketchy ties when it comes to opposition research. I guess my question is, when you are running for president of the United States, when you're trying to keep your nose completely clean because the media smears every little thing you do and every little thing you say, when you read a line in an email, like the ones Don Jr. released on his Twitter account this morning that says, the Russian government has an interest in helping your father win, especially when Russia has been an adversary of the United States, doesn't that put up any red flags, or should it?
Yeah, of course it's a red flag. And any time that you think a foreign government is trying to interfere or potentially interfere, or that is stipulated that an outside entity wants to help influence a U.S. election cycle, of course that's a red flag. And my guess would be is that Donald Trump Jr. took that meeting at the request of a friend of his to meet with someone who he thought might have information that could be useful, but it sounded more like the meeting actually talked about the adoption problems between U.S. citizens adopting Russian babies, and that's something that has been well documented in the past that Vladimir Putin had prevented from continuing to take place. And I think this was a courtesy meeting. And if you look at the statements that this lawyer from Russia has made, she said that two other individuals who were part of that meeting, one came in and spent about 5 or 8 minutes there and got up and left and did not return. And the second individual was a person who was very occupied on their phone reading something and didn't seem to engage in the meeting. And so if this was a meeting where information would have been given that would have directly helped the Trump campaign win the election, I would think that the other individuals in that meeting would have been much more in tune to what she was saying and probably paid more attention, not left the meeting early.
Right, or not been on their phone. No, I agree with you. It seems to me from the information that we have so far, which is just this New York Times article and then the statements made by the Trump family and the Trump administration, it seems like the meeting itself was not the problem. My problem with it, and I don't see so far any example or any evidence of treason or of criminal wrongdoing like the left is accusing Donald Trump Jr. of at this time. It seems to me, though, that just that email would have been enough to say, wait a second, don't need Russian help here. We can win the election based off of our own merits. As you remember, Corey, James Comey, former FBI director, fired FBI director, he testified under oath in Congress that it was not true about connections. It was materially not true about connections between the Trump campaign and the Russians. I think that still holds, but given this new information, in your opinion, should this be investigated further?
Well, what I think is very clear is that if you look at the intelligence committees in Congress, both the House and the Senate, you look at the bipartisan nature of it, the Republicans and the Democrats, they have all said that there is no evidence whatsoever that there has been any collusion, coordination, or cooperation between the Trump campaign and the Russians in order to impact the outcome of the last election cycle. And so when you've got individuals like Nancy Pelosi and Maxine Waters and other Democrats, clearly not conservatives, clearly people who don't think that this president is pushing the country in the right direction, saying that they have found no evidence whatsoever that the campaign, President-elect Trump or then President or now President Trump has done anything to coordinate with the Russians. I think that's very, very clear. And the question that we should really be asking is what role does the special counsel still have in looking into this if on a bipartisan level, House and Senate, Republicans and Democrats have said there is nothing here to see as it relates to collusion or coordination.
Right, and I think the answer to that is pretty easy. It's a diversion tactic for a lot of the other things that President Trump is accomplishing. I mean, we saw that just this weekend with his speech in Poland, that the mainstream media was so focused on his handshake with Vladimir Putin so they could ignore the content of what I consider one of his best of all time speeches. Corey,